In pursuit of life and liberty, thousands of Central Americans fleeing violence and poverty are heading for the U.S. border. But what will happen when they reach it? I'm Imran Garza, and today's newsmaker is the Migrant Caravan. Driven from Honduras by gang violence and poverty, thousands of Central American migrants are marching through Mexico. U.S. President Donald Trump has alerted the military, claiming the migrant caravan is a national emergency. The Trump administration says the crowd is being funded by leftists and that it poses a threat to the U.S. because it may have been infiltrated by bad people from the Middle East. The Mexican government has been under pressure to stop the caravan and has called on the migrants to apply for asylum in Mexico. Trump has warned that the U.S. will cut aid to Central American countries if undocumented migrants continue their journey north. Is he serious, or is this just political posturing ahead of midterm elections? For more, here's Sandra Gutman.
They're risking their lives and risking failure together. Thousands of migrants have been marching from Honduras, seeking opportunity and safety in Mexico and beyond.
La situación en nuestro país no está nada fácil. Entonces tenemos que huir para poder salir un poco adelante.
No somos gente de mal. Nosotros venimos luchando, huyendo de nuestro país y queremos trabajar.
Aparte de la violencia, venimos huyendo de la necesidad que tenemos los hondureños, porque no podemos alimentar a nuestra familia.
Que nosotros aquí estamos aguantando agua, hambre y sol para ir a luchar allá, al sueño americano.
The so-called caravan began as a group of 160 migrants setting off from Honduras. When it reached Guatemala, it had amassed more than 1,500 people. By the time it reached Mexico, there were 3,000. But the Mexican river border was closed, forcing some, the most desperate, to find other ways to cross. Against the odds, thousands persevered and eventually made it to Mexico.
Large numbers of people are arriving in Mexico today and are likely to remain in the country for an extended period. At this time, it is estimated that the caravan comprises some 7,233 persons, many of whom intend to continue the march north.
The caravan is still a month away from reaching the U.S., but President Trump has threatened to close the border and deploy troops to stop the migrants. This isn't even the first caravan of Central Americans this year, but it's become the focus of a battle between U.S. Republicans and Democrats ahead of congressional elections in just 2 weeks' time.
He's hoping to drive Republicans out to the polls by stoking fears and misinformation about migrants.
Why is this happening? Because an entire political party is inviting it and encouraging it. They believe unchecked immigration will strengthen their hold on power.
The caravan that's now making its way through Mexico, headed for the southern border, was organized by leftist organizations and financed by Venezuela. As we've said...
And the Democrats, maybe? And the Democrats?
Well...
Trump also suggested that terrorists are among the migrants.
They say it happens all the time from the Middle East. It's not even saying bad or good, but some real bad ones. But if they intercept, well, they could very well be. There's no proof of anything. There's no proof of anything.
As the political row heats up, in Mexico, the migrants are pressing on. The road is tough. Families are hitching rides and finding supplies wherever they can. Faced with pressure from the U.S. and its threat to stop regional aid, Central American leaders have been trying to encourage migrants to return.
Don't let yourself be fooled. Take care of your lives and understand the enormous risk and danger that you're putting yourselves through.
But this week, another caravan set off from Guatemala. The long and dangerous journey ahead and the very real risk of never making it to America isn't stopping them. Sandra Gutman, The Newsmakers.
Well, to discuss this, I'm joined now by Amapola Hansberger in Orlando, Florida. She's the founder and president of Legal Immigrants for America. In Washington, D.C., We have Ivan Garcia Hidalgo. He's the president of the Hispanic Leadership Council. In Wilmington, Delaware is Arturo Vizcarra. He's an activist and immigration attorney. And with me here in the studio is our very own TRT World correspondent, Randolph Nogel. Thanks, everybody, for joining us. Amapola Hansberger, can I begin with you first, ma'am? Tell me why you're not a big fan of the migrant caravan.
Well, I represent the voice of millions of legal immigrants from those countries: Honduras, Nicaragua, Costa Rica, Venezuela. Well, Venezuela is South America. And we are for the rule of law. It is a lot harder to do what they are doing than it is to go to the American embassy to file forms and subject themselves to the vetting process.
So Arturo Vizcarra, the argument is, okay, you might be facing persecution, poverty, violence. Go to the US embassy and file legal papers and go through the process. Why get on the road on a major caravan to make it to the US? Tell me why you disagree with that.
I mean, there isn't a process for people to apply at the U.S. embassies. I mean, even recently there was a Central American minors program where they were allowing a very limited amount of minors that have parents with status in the United States to apply from the embassies, and that program was cut, was abolished by President Trump. There is no process for people to do that. And on top of that, applying for asylum at the port of entry is legal process. This is people following the one and only option that they have if they want to try to come to the United States. This is the only one. There's a story about one person who actually was a legal permanent resident, a green card holder who lost his green card, and the U.S. embassy, according to him, told him, hey, the best thing that you can do is get to the United States border and apply for entry there, and an immigration judge will later look at you.
Ivan Garcia Hidalgo. Okay, Ivan, so we have the president who tweeted that there were criminals and unknown Middle Easterners, with the implication that just being Middle Eastern makes you sort of suspicious. Was that a bad idea from the president? Did he make a big mistake in saying that by assuming criminality to a bunch of people he doesn't know anything about?
Well, no, I think that was very, very accurate. We know that there are MS-13 and criminal element in there. We know this is coordinated and organized by cartels and other organizations. Nobody just, maybe one person or maybe three can say let's go hit the border, but not 17,000 where the number is approximately today. This is a well-funded, well-coordinated assault and invasion on our country. We know for a fact Jimmy Morales, the Guatemalan president, said he has captured 100 ISIS terrorists in his country. So we know that there's criminal element and probably terrorist element. Hold on. We know from the previous administration, from when Chavez was president, that he was giving out.
Okay, I'm interested because I have to jump in here. You've mentioned the word ISIS as well. Is there any evidence whatsoever that there's a terrorist or criminal element within this crowd? Do you have any evidence?
Well, I think there isn't any evidence to show otherwise right now, is there? Because we don't know who these people are. Okay. That's the problem. Okay. That's the problem with illegal immigration, a caravan like this, and legal immigration. If they were looking for asylum, if they're true asylum seekers, they would go to a consulate, an embassy, file for asylum, go through a regular process, but that's not what they're doing. They're attacking the border, 17,000 at a time. They're crashing the border. We saw what happened with the Mexican border. The Mexican were tried to put a wall, tried to put a barrier, and they went right through it. Okay. And that's exactly what their intention is. Okay. They want to assault the border. They want to raid the country and try and get in.
Crashing the border, raiding the country. Amapola, you're nodding in agreement here. So Amapola, is that what you think as well, that these people need to prove that they are not criminals and terrorists rather than the other way around?
And even if they don't prove it, look at their body language. I'm sorry, but burning the United States of America's flag is an act of terror. It's an act of aggression against our country, and it cannot be permitted.
Who did that?
They did, the caravan. They burned the flag, and then they said, we're coming to get you in those some words like that to Mr. Trump. I'm sorry, he's a duly elected president of the United States, and we have to respect them. And if they are foreigners, aliens, and they don't respect them when they are in their own land, what are they going to do when they are in America?
Okay, and it's interesting.
Sorry,
okay.
That to me is an act of aggression.
Okay, act of aggression, crashing into the border, invading, burning the flags, we're coming for you. And it's been good to hear that perspective from both Amapola and from Ivan. Our correspondent was recently in Central America. Randy, you spoke to a lot of these people who are trying to either get to Mexico or get to the United States or wherever they can find a better life. Is it accurate at all? You've spoken to them. Is it accurate at all that some of them might have been paid by others for political agendas? Tell me, what was it like? What were these people about? Who were they?
Well, I was on the Mexico-Guatemala border to see who was coming across, and obviously my testimony here is anecdotal at best, but the people that I met were incredibly desperate. I interviewed one young woman who was living in San Miguel, Salvador. She had to flee because she was caught up in basically what amounts to systemic rape. They basically take a family member hostage and then force young women, oftentimes under the age of 18, to sleep with one of the MS-13 gang members. So this is very problematic for these people. I don't know that they necessarily have the resources or even the information to go through the formal process. She was very afraid when we were interviewing her. She was looking around. And just to respond to one of your other guests, what she mentioned, this image of the American flag burning, I just recently read an article that broke down a lot of the misinformation that's been flowing around, images of this caravan traveling on buses and on trains, images of skin rashes saying they're bringing in diseases, and this image of the American flag. And a lot of these images have been sourced to other times and places.
Amapola, is it possible that you're wrong? Is it possible that even if this might have occurred, maybe one person might have done it, but you're assuming and you're maybe ascribing the guilt to an entire group of people, some of which include people such as those that Randy met, women who have survived rape, for example, and are trying to get to the US for a better life?
Well, as for the argument that desperation justifies aggression, it is wrong. If we look at all of the Central American countries, including the one I was born in, Nicaragua, they have, there are disasters. There is a disaster, and they're all disasters. And the only way that we can fix that is by asking the United Nations to come to those nations and try to restore law and order and protect the citizens. I feel for them, I really do. I'm Central American and I have compassion. But for us to absorb the entire population of Central America is not practical. It's impossible.
Arturo, I've given you a few minutes to absorb, Arturo, a lot of the arguments from the other guests. Come and respond now. I know you're chomping at the bit.
Well, I mean, it's obvious that they're both also listening to a lot of fake news, a lot of right-wing propaganda, a lot of things that are, circulated on the internet that aren't even true, and then they don't, care to follow up on that. I would say, secondly, these countries, I'm from El Salvador, and I was with the previous caravan that traveled through parts of Mexico in April. And I'd say it's very obvious that these people are just desperate people that are fleeing regimes, that are fleeing governments that, for example, Honduras, it's a dictatorship that the United States has supported. Since the 2009 military coup, the United States is responsible for the chaos that's created in these countries. And then we can go back to the Monroe Doctrine, we can go back to just the invasions of Nicaragua, of Honduras, the banana wars of the 1900s, and then just even more recently, the 1980s, the interventions, the dirty wars of the supporting dictatorships in Central America. The United States owes these countries reparations.
Okay, but be that as it may, Arturo, let me come in here. Be that as it may.
I'm sorry.
Don't the others have a point, Arturo, that the U.S. is a country with laws and that there's a border and that you can close your border and not have somebody come in unless they have a legal right to come in, no more, no less?
Applying for asylum at the border, at the port of entry, is legal. I mean, this shouldn't be a conversation. This isn't an argument. This is the only legal route that people have. People have the legal route to move into these other countries as well and apply for asylum in Mexico. Central Americans have the legal right to move freely between Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador, and Nicaragua. What the U.S. is asking other countries to do is to violate their already established international domestic laws. Now they come to the port of entry to apply for asylum. There's nothing illegal about that. That's what people are supposed to do. I'm
going to give you a chance in a second, but I want to bring in Ivan.
That
Ivan,
is wrong.
Just a second. Just a second. I'm going to bring you in a second,
Yes.
right? I want to bring in Ivan. Ivan, I want to ask you: is your country that weak? I mean, really, the United States, the global superpower. Is it really true that there's this existential fear that 7,000 people are going to come and bust the border and invade and kind of destroy your country? Or are you all really being played during election season ahead of the midterms? The president's stoking anxieties, isn't he?
No, as a matter of fact, it's not 7, it's 17,000 at this point. That's what the estimate is. But here's the deal, right? Here's reality. Reality is, if these people are really seeking asylum and they're running away from this chaos, persecution, violence, whatever it is, they would go seek the nearest safe haven. Why wouldn't they go to Costa Rica? Why not seek asylum in Mexico? Why does it have to come to the United States? The United States cannot take the world's problems. We have always been open to legal immigration.
Ivan, why did your ancestors choose the United States?
We have been open to helping everybody.
Why did your family choose the U.S.? Why didn't they go to the country that was next door to where you came from? I mean,
we didn't migrate through a caravan. Yeah. We didn't come through the crash on the border. My family showed up through legal immigration, like millions of Americans have, and they went through a process and they got approved, and that's the way it works.
But who are you
that's
to
what
decide
America is.
they
it's
should
a
go to
country
Costa
of law
Rica
and
and not the U.S.
Of respect and a process.
Well, but who are you to decide?
What's that?
The point is, why shouldn't they have the right to go to the U.S. and apply? And whether the U.S. accepts them or not, that's up to your legal system.
They can apply wherever they want. Go to the embassy. Go to the embassy, like my parents did. Go to the embassy, apply for a visa, qualify, and travel freely. Absolutely. That's the way it works. You can't just sit there and show up and say, I'm seeking asylum. Let me in.
Okay.
Here's a problem.
Okay.
These people have been coached. They understand that if they crash the border, they show up with children, they're going to be caught and they're going to be released because they can't separate the families.
Ivan, have you spoken to any of them?
What happens? 98% of those caught under that situation never show up to court.
Ivan, have you spoken to any of them?
Ever. So they're free and they're illegal in the country. It takes us 40.
Ivan, have you spoken to any of them?
What it takes us a year to deport, they come in 48 hours. So Ivan, imagine the exodus.
Ivan, you're just filibustering
Border Patrol says
Ivan,
that more or less we're. What?
Ivan, you're filibustering. Have you spoken to any of them? Do you know what they think? Do you know whether they've been coached?
I've talked to illegals my entire life.
You haven't spoken to anyone on the caravan?
No, I have not talked to anybody in the caravan.
Amapola, I want to bring in Amapola. She's been meaning to speak for a while. Amapola.
Yes. About reparations, the only people that America owed reparations to is the African American population, because they were brought in as slaves. In Latin America, we speak Spanish. The conquistadores were from Spain. They were not British. Why is it that people look at the United States of America as the villain or the, they haven't done anything but to send aid.
Okay, but this is a deeper question.
And they accept
this is a deeper question about
people.
This is a very deep. It's a deeper question about the very foundations of U.S. society, right? And I mean, I think many Native Americans would even dispute this, but that's a different discussion. Just as we wrap up here, Randolph, ahead of the midterms, if we look at President Trump at the very beginning.
Before you wrap up, could I say something? Could I say something?
Okay, go ahead.
Article 4, Section 4 of the United States of American Constitution says clearly that the United States shall guarantee to every state in this union a republican form of government and shall protect each of them against invasion. These people are invading the other countries, and they are
and for some other people,
well, their purpose is to invade America.
Yeah, that's a great point. Hold on. Mexico. Why don't they stay in Mexico?
Okay, and for some people, what takes precedence over that is give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses, which is on the Statue of Liberty. Randolph, as I wrap up here, because I want to look at the contemporary politics as we wrap, looking ahead of the midterms, we saw President Trump, and you've been covering this closely, as a candidate, talking about we're going to build a wall and Mexico's going to pay for it. We saw the Muslim ban, the proposed Muslim ban, and then it got adjusted and changed. In the build-up halfway during the midterms, we have this now. What does it say about the tone of the presidency and what we can expect for the next 2 years?
Absolutely. Well, I mean, following President Trump, his campaign and his presidency, we're used to him using superlatives, using hyperbole, obviously saying things like Mexico is going to build the wall. There's been no proof, and there's been denial after denial. And even with the influx of illegal migration, often being measured by apprehensions at the border, arrests at the border, the numbers, if you go to the Customs and Border website, they're far, far lower. They were extraordinarily high in the year 2000, 2004 through 2006. They topped 1 million. Now, I think last year they were around 300,000. So if you look at it from a wide-angle view, it seems as though the number of illegal immigrants trying to get into the country is falling, and yet the rhetoric is ratcheting up and right before campaign season. What I can say is that a number of Americans do seem to feel disenchanted with their politics. They look at Trump as, President Trump as a savior figure, and they don't seem to care that much about whether the statements he's making are factually accurate.
And the guy said there were criminals and unknown Middle Easterners when he was asked for evidence.
We like President Trump.
Certainly. But the president couldn't provide any evidence
I'm sorry.
that there were criminals and Middle Easterners when he was asked. He said, I'm sure there could be evidence. You check it out for yourself.
You know, I can talk about the midterms if you want, and you look at the poll numbers right now. You look at mainstream media poll numbers. He's at 47%. He's higher than Obama was going into the 2010 elections.
Although that doesn't make him right.
Look at the numbers from Rasmussen. He's at 51%. The blue wave situation doesn't exist. We're going to pick up seats in the Senate. We're probably going to end up controlling the House or losing it by a few seats. So this blue wave situation is unreal.
Ivan and
he's taking, you look at the Harvard Marist
numbers, we're going to get you back on the show.
And he's taking 93% of the news that goes out.
I have other discussions to have on the show, so we're going to have you both back on the show. I promise. I'm Apollo and Ivan. I hope you'll come back on the show. I'd appreciate that. Unfortunately, I have other issues to cover. Arturo, thank you as well. And Randolph. Still to come on the newsmakers, the U.S. pulls out of a Cold War nuclear treaty with Russia. Did Moscow violate the pact? And could Trump trigger a new atomic race? And a religious rupture. The Russian Orthodox Church cuts ties with Istanbul for recognizing the independence of the Ukrainian Church. Another bold move by the U.S. president this week was to withdraw from a landmark nuclear arms treaty with Russia. The pact, known as the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, was signed in the final years of the Cold War, and it eliminated mid-range nuclear missiles from Europe. The U.S. National Security Advisor John Bolton says Russia has been violating the agreement by deploying a system that could enable it to launch a nuclear strike on Europe at short notice. But Moscow has dismissed those claims, saying the U.S. withdrawal is very dangerous and could lead to retaliation. So, is the world now at greater risk of nuclear annihilation? Haider Abbasi reports.
For decades, the world lived in fear of annihilation. The United States and the Soviet Union were threatening each other with the most destructive weapon on Earth, the atomic bomb. It was so powerful that it could wipe out cities in seconds. Those fears calmed down after the end of the Cold War in the 1980s. But is there about to be another nuclear arms race?
Russia has not adhered to the agreement. They should have been done years ago. Until people come to their senses, we have more money than anybody else by far. We'll build it up.
The agreement Trump is referring to is the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, or INF. Washington says Russia has violated the deal. In response, the US says it will withdraw from the treaty and expand its nuclear arsenal. The INF treaty was signed in 1987 by then Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev and then US President Ronald Reagan. It required both countries to eliminate short and medium-range missiles in Europe. This includes nuclear and conventional weapons with ranges of between 500 to 5,500 kilometers. The US says Moscow has deployed a land-based missile system that could strike Europe at short notice. Russia denies this. Without the treaty, there are fears the US could place new nuclear weapons in Europe. Russia's president says his government will be forced to respond in the same way.
The main question is what they will do with these newly available missiles. If they deliver them to Europe, naturally, our response will have to mirror this. The European countries which agree to this will have to understand that they put their own territory under threat of a possible retaliatory strike.
It's not just the Americans who believe Russia has not honored the weapons treaty.
State clearly that the most plausible explanation is that Russia now is in violation of the treaty. And therefore the challenge, the problem is the Russian behavior, which we have seen over many years.
There are now concerns that another important nuclear deal between the US and Russia could be under threat. The Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, or START, signed in 1991, is due to expire in 2021. Under the agreement, both countries must limit the number of deployed nuclear arms. The US has an estimated nuclear stockpile of 4,000. Of these, 1,800 are deployed on weapon systems. Russia has an estimated stockpile of 4,350. 1,600 are deployed on weapon systems. But as the INF treaty has broken down, the stockpiles of both countries could increase. So can we expect another nuclear arms race? And what can be done to ease suspicions between the US and Russia? Haider Abbasi, The Newsmakers.
Joining me now from Washington is Greg Tillman. He's a State Department advisor to the U.S. delegation at the Geneva INF negotiations. From Moscow, we have Andrei Frolov. He's a researcher at the Center for Analysis, Strategies and Technologies, as well as the editor-in-chief of the Arms Export magazine. And completing our panel is Alex Titus. He's a policy advisor at America First Policies. Gentlemen, thanks for joining us. Greg Tillman, I take it you're not happy that the U.S. has withdrawn from the INF treaty. Tell me why.
Well, this is a very disappointing development. The INF treaty has been very successful over its 31-year course in eliminating an entire category of nuclear weapons, eliminating nearly 2,700 nuclear-armed missiles in the U.S. and Soviet, then Russian arsenals. So this treaty not only achieved those spectacular limitations, but it also created a model for verification measures that was used in the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty that followed it. So it's very disappointing that this treaty is going to be abandoned, and particularly so in that the Trump administration has neither consulted with Congress nor with our closest allies for whom the treaty was initially negotiated.
Andrei Frolov, there's a feeling that the Russians have been cheating over the years. Even the Obama administration had suggested that Russia had violated the INF So Bolton and Trump are just basically doing what the US has wanted to for a while because Russia's not been playing by the rules. Is that true?
I don't think that's true because the general Russian point is that up to now, United States have not presented any evidences regarding Russian violation of INF Treaty, and the problem is that even in Russia, nobody sees the real sense to violate the INF because you see that you don't need to violate the INF because you can just put more fuel into missile and that goes further. And if you put just half of the tank, it goes under the limit of INF Treaty. So here, the majority of experts doesn't understand even such kind of approach, why Russia did need to violate INF. So we have two problems. There is no need to violate it, and there is no evidence up to now. But last week, Mr. Lavrov said that United States had provided some information regarding this mysterious missile, which has been the main reason of violation of INF Treaty from Russian side.
Okay, so Alex Titus, politically and in terms of trust, you have this treaty that has been enduring for more than 30 years and verified over the years, which essentially says our deadliest weapons we won't have in the same neighborhood and we won't have next door to you, and that will reduce the impact of craziness happening. That will reduce the impact of catastrophe. Why on earth would the Trump administration want to get out of something like that?
You know, President Trump has been very clear since he came into office with his America First policy agenda. And I think that this international agreement, among a host of others, is just one that the Trump administration has finally called the bluff on. I mean, we know that Russia is cheating on this. The Obama administration released information regarding it. The State Department followed up on it in 2017. We know that the Russians are not abiding by the agreement. And I mean, of course, I don't think that the president or his team would argue that when the agreement first came into place that this was a good thing that got rid of a lot of really powerful short-range missiles that potentially could have had a devastating impact on Europe and the Soviet Union. But I mean, changing times call for changing measures, as well as I think another thing that needs to be recognized is that tensions between Russia and the U.S. are obviously much lower than they've been since during the Cold War. And I think that this is a smart approach from the Trump administration in terms of potentially deploying some of these missiles to the different Pacific area in terms of pushing back against China. So I think that sort of the agreement is less so important from the Russia perspective, which we do know that they are cheating, but also that the Trump administration is using this to push back against Beijing as well.
Greg Tillman, that sounds like a tactical argument. Does any of that make sense to you?
Well, it's very interesting when one hears that the United States needs to deploy this category of weapon systems in order to presumably better protect our allies or defend U.S. interests. It's very interesting that the Vice Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff said specifically that his forces in the Pacific can cover their Chinese targets, and there is no need for a ground-based system. And logically, the United States relies on air-based and sea-based systems in the Pacific. It does not need to counter Chinese ground-based systems. So there is a significant flaw in the argument that we very much need these missiles. Similarly, in Europe, we have air-based and sea-based options if there is a military need to counter the systems. But I'd like to go back to the Russian violation, too, and just point out that the United States, I would say, was slow in providing details of Russian violations of the treaty. This is mostly because of sensitivity about revealing our sources and methods of gaining intelligence. But the point is that the Russians tested a system that clearly had a range beyond what was allowed under the treaty. And we slowly trickled out details of when and where this testing occurred. Then the Russians subsequently actually deployed to 2 different locations operational missiles, and we slowly provided more details. And it was only 3 years after we first made this complaint that the U.S. identified the culpable system, the Novator 9M729. That was a very important breakthrough because now we have an argument over what is the capability of that very specific system that the Russians acknowledge. So that should be the task of of the treaty and its Special Verification Commission to drill down, get experts inspecting, and find out what is the capability of this particular system.
Okay, so Alex, before we say goodbye to you, the point Greg's making is that when you stay within the treaty, you can figure this stuff out. You leave, and you're in the dark, and then you're playing a game of chicken with the other side. Again, we're going back to the Cold War. Why would you do that?
Well, again, I mean, I don't think that we're going back to the Cold War. I mean, tensions are nowhere between the U.S. and Russia that they were near the height of the Cold War, especially as this treaty was signed. Now, again, I agree with Greg, and I think the Trump administration would as well, that when this treaty was first put in place, this was a very good thing that we were able to sort of die down the tensions and get rid of a lot of these missiles. But I mean, as we've said, we know that Russia is cheating. We know they have their SSC-8s. I mean, this is fairly well documented. But as Greg said, they have been slow to release the information because that could potentially sort of give off to the Russians of how we've participated in this intelligence gathering. Now, in terms of staying in the treaty, I mean, the Trump administration has not left yet. They have made the intentions to withdraw, and I think that they're right to make those intentions. Now, it could be interesting to see if Putin and Trump actually talk about this, if they do potentially meet in November, and if that could be another thing on the actual docket. But for now, I think the Trump administration is making the right decision to put America first.
All right, Alex, thanks for being with us. Good to have you on the show again. We're going to say goodbye to you for now. Let's bring in Peter Altsoff. He's a professor of international security at National Defense University. He joins us from Raleigh, North Carolina. Peter, good to have you on the Newsmakers again. Mr. Gorbachev, who knows a thing or two about the Cold War, has said he's a bit worried about the U.S. leaving the INF and what Bolton's been saying, because there's a feeling that you start with the INF and then you go to START, and then you lose all the goodwill built up over these decades, and everybody begins the arms race again. Is that accurate, Peter?
Yes, this is quite accurate. I'm a bit conflicted on this whole situation because I can understand the logic behind the decision of the Trump administration, because today, of course, the situation is very different and everyone is cheating. But I think still the negative consequences of this decision are more significant because that treaty had a tremendous ideological and psychological component for the security of Europe. Today, basically, we are saying that this is really the end of the post-Cold War order, and basically everyone is able and has their hands open to do whatever they want in terms of the military arms race. And who benefits from that? First of all, Vladimir Putin, for his own propaganda purposes. The Russian TV now says that this is all the fault of the Americans. The Americans are doing that. So now they are totally justified, basically, to intensify the production of nukes. And the consequences for Europe are also quite drastic. A country like Germany is very unlikely to ever agree to have American nuclear weapons on its territory, but the country like Poland or Lithuania are very likely to. And that will lead to a new Cuban Missile Crisis, and it will be much worse.
Okay, so Andrei Frolov, the perspective coming from Peter is that Vladimir Putin is milking this and he's enjoying it because he gets to say, we can't trust those Americans, look at them, they're being aggressive towards us. Is that what's going on?
I don't think that Mr. Putin is very happy regarding this situation, and I would like to remind my counterparts that Mr. Bolton said against INF Treaty even in 2011, and he published an article in Wall Street Journal regarding explaining that the United States needed to withdraw from INF Treaty. So it was years before the Crimea, Ukraine, and Syria. So I think this is a kind of it's a part of U.S. elite who did want and want now to withdraw from INF. So from the Russian point of view, I think that Mr. Putin said yesterday that Russia can respond to the withdrawal of INF Treaty, and that's true because I think Russia has some technical means to develop and to produce missiles which now are banned under INF Treaty, and this is will be firstly a threat not for the United States but for Europe, and maybe in the future it will be kind of playing card between the relationship between Russia and the European Union and the European NATO member states, not between US and Russia as it is now.
Peter?
Yes, I think still the negative consequences are really benefiting China, benefiting Russia, and creating a very dangerous security situation in Europe, and particularly in terms of a psychological climate, the relations between European allies, the relations, say, between Germany on the one hand and like Lithuania, or say some pro-Russian countries like Bulgaria. We can see again the positioning of mid-range nukes in Europe, and that's going to be disastrous.
Greg Tillman, big picture here. The U.S. pulling out of the Iran deal, despite all the efforts that went into it. We're seeing the U.S. signaling that it's pulling out of INF, fears that START will be dismantled. And when we look at the numbers, both the United States and Russia, who both have thousands of nuclear warheads, have at least spent billions at least trying to maintain them, if not to expand the stockpiles. Is it a myth that we're moving towards nuclear disarmament and actually we might be going the other way around?
Well, that's exactly what the concern is, that getting out of the INF Treaty in this manner before the sides have even actually tried to resolve their compliance issues is very ominous, and one sees that even in the response to President Putin's request that the U.S. and Russia sign up for an extension of the new Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, which is incorporated in the treaty, does not require ratification. That's very unfortunate, because that's the next obvious step in order to at least hold the line so that the situation doesn't deteriorate. But John Bolton, and I agree here with Mr. Frolov, John Bolton is using Russia's violation of the INF Treaty as an excuse. John Bolton is hostile to all nuclear arms treaties with Russia. History has shown that over the years. And so the problem we have is that someone who is hostile to all arms control treaties is working for a president who is also hostile to international agreements, but is also quite ignorant of the details of those agreements. And so it's a dangerous combination that exists in the United States right now. And what is needed is an attempt to resolve the differences in the treaty. An easy thing for the United States to do would be to invite the Russians to come and look at the launchers of ballistic missile defenses that Russia has complained about, to demonstrate those cannot launch INF missiles, and then to put pressure on the Russians to offer reciprocal inspections by U.S. inspectors to assure us that those missiles that we're concerned about are not capable as INF systems.
Yeah, well, nukes are no joke, and any movement with regards nukes will definitely capture the imagination of people around the world. I'm reminded of what Carl Sagan said at the height of the Cold War regarding the nuclear arms race. Two sworn enemies, both waist deep in gasoline, one with 3 matches and the other with 5. Gentlemen, I have to move on, but it's been a pleasure having you on the Newsmakers. Greg Tillman, Andrei Frolov, and Peter Elsov. Thanks again.
The issue of tomos and autocephaly goes far beyond church life. That's why the authorities joined to resolve this issue. It's a question of our independence. It's a question of our national security. It's a question of our statehood, and it's a question of world geopolitics.
It's the biggest split in the Orthodox Church for the past millennium. The Russian Orthodox Church announced last week it had severed all ties with the Ecumenical Patriarchate of Constantinople. It happened after its leader here in Istanbul recognized the independence of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. The move came after years of growing tensions in Ukraine over the independence of its church, particularly in the wake of Russia's annexation of Crimea. For Russia, the split seems as much geopolitical as spiritual, and it argues that Ukraine is pushing the church to the brink of catastrophe. Well, to discuss this, I'm joined now from Kiev by Vasyl Filipchuk. He's the former spokesman for the Ukrainian Foreign Ministry. And in Belfast, we have Alexander Titov. He's a political analyst focusing on Russian foreign policy and history. Alexander, let me begin with you. Is this more about politics and far less about theology?
Yeah, I think that's right. And only I would add a caveat that is about eternal Ukrainian politics rather than anything else. because essentially the whole issue of the Fekale is basically used by Poroshenko to give something to his electorate to help him win in the first round. And he's using the issue of church, decided to use the issue of church for that end.
Okay, so Vasil, is Petro Poroshenko just using this for cynical political ends?
Well, there is no doubt in this. Very few people really question. The problem is different. First of all, Ukraine is a very complex country in terms of language or religion. I can just start from my own example. My parents are going to Ukrainian Orthodox Church of Kiev Patriarchate. My brother is going to Orthodox Church of Russian Patriarchate. My sister is going to Greek Catholic Church, and myself, I don't go to church, but if I need, I would go better to Catholic Church. And you know, it's never been any problem inside of my family or inside of the country. There was a big respect. There was no problem of using different religions. So basically, this artificial problem, which has been created by Ukrainian political elite now, may really lead to serious split, to serious difficulties in the country, as artificially state started to interfere into religious issues.
Okay, yeah, that's interesting.
It can really be.
That's interesting. Let me bring in Alexander here for a second. Yeah, Alexander, do you agree that rather than this creating more problems between Ukraine and Russia, it's going to create splits within Ukrainian society?
Well, I think you can't really create more splits between Ukraine and Russia than it's already the case. So yes, that's right. The main issue will be within the Ukrainian society, which, as absolutely rightly said, is very diverse, very complex. It's unfortunate that the president is trying to boost his electoral support by appealing to a relatively narrow nationalist electorate and using the issue of church to that end, which is not going to do him Ukraine any favors, because I mean, the last thing Ukraine needs is another conflict over a church, particularly if the newly established church would try to seize some property from the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of Moscow Patriarchate, and then it will really be dangerous and blood might flow. Okay, so blood might flow. Vasil, do you fear that blood might flow? There's already enough trouble in the Donbass. There's already trouble in Crimea, or at least an annexation and an unresolved element of Crimea. Might blood flow over this? Might people get that angry over this?
I hope not. I really pray every day not, but risks exist, and the risks are very serious, because religious issue is probably the only one single where people really feel it's something really holy is touching their soul. They don't really believe the state, which failed to fulfill its basic functions in terms of security, economic well-being, the state may interfere into religious issues. Basically, we understand why authorities are now promoting this issue, because corruption is not defeated, conflict is not settled. So to promote candidature for presidential elections, there should be something new. And if religion is taken, then people just feel, well, it's too far. The red line is crossed. So I hope that authorities are really aware about all the risks, because there is nothing more, nothing bloodier than religious wars. We remember last millennium how many blood was because of religious wars, and I hope it will not be our case, but the game which has been launched is really very risky and very dangerous.
Yeah. Alexander, Moscow protesting, the Moscow Patriarch has forbidden their churches to have anything to do with Patriarch Bartholomew of the Constantinople Church. Beyond that, are we going to see Moscow do anything more?
Well, I think they have a range of options they can use, and they will probably use it. Basically, the Orthodox world, there's no single authority. and there's various lots of councils and meetings and so forth. The Patriarch of Constantinople been traditionally given the role of chairman or the leading figure there. Now the Moscow can start to challenge that and say that, hang on, no, we're not having that. So it will try to undermine his authority in the Orthodox world. It might do other things, such as, for example, opening, there's lots of Russians going to Turkey, which usually go to the Constantinople Patriarchate churches there. They might try to open Russian churches instead of a Moscow Patriarchate. They might, for example, try to instigate rebellion on the Mount Athos, which is a very important peninsula with many monasteries, again closely linked to Russia, but formerly under the Patriarchate of Constantinople. So yeah, there are lots of things they can do to undermine authority of the Patriarch of Constantinople.
Okay,
if they chose to.
Okay, so Vasil, as a former civil servant within the foreign ministry, as somebody who represented Ukraine and everything it meant to the outside world, what's your message to President Poroshenko?
Well, I think President has to care about what is his constitutional obligation. His constitutional obligation is foreign policy, defense, guarantee human rights, constitutional rights, and he should focus on what is in Constitution and not to interfere into church affairs, which are absolutely out of competence of any state authority. So I think that if you don't know what to do, just follow rule of law, follow constitution, follow legislation, and I think it's the only thing which should be done by Ukrainian authorities.
Okay, gentlemen, it's been really good dipping into this issue with both of you and getting a sense of where we are right now. It's been a pleasure. I hope to have you both on the program again, Alexander Titov and Vasil Filipchuk. For the moment, I have to move on. Thanks for joining us on the Newsmakers. And that's all for this edition of the Newsmakers with me, Imran Gavda. You can check out more of our stories on YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter. Remember to like, follow, and subscribe. Until next time, thank you for watching. Bye-bye.